Good morning, Year 5-6, and welcome to another week of online learning. We are continuing with the book of Oceanology and following the formal journal of Zoticus de Lesseps. And that's going to be the start of today's lesson where, as last week, we're going to have some text talk, thinking of questions, and we're going to do some vocabulary work to identify and develop our knowledge of vocabulary. We're then going to recap on the difference between a phrase and a clause. And finally today, we're going to recognise a subordinate clause in a piece of writing. To start with though, I would like us to have a recap on what we did last week. And I've created a quiz. There are 10 marks in the quiz, and I would like you to see how many questions you can get right. I'm going to quickly read through them. You're going to press pause and spend 5 or 10 minutes having a go. Try not to look back at what you did last week to see if you can remember. We will go through the answers on the next slide. So the first question, who is the name of the character writing the formal journal? What year is the journal written? Who is the narrator, the person writing the journal, assistant to? Who was the salty fisherman harpooner the narrator was introduced to? They travelled on the Queen Hortense to start. Can you remember the type of boat it is? Between which two places did the Queen Hortense travel between? Quite a tricky question, that one. On the expedition, they are looking forward to observing the flora and fauna of the seas. What are flora and fauna? On the way to the destination, a strange contraption like a submarine emerges from the water. What is the name of the contraption? Who is the captain of the strange contraption? When travelling on this strange contraption, they were butted aggressively by some sea creatures. What were the sea creatures? And why did one of the characters think that the creatures in the question above butted the submarine? Why did they do that? Okay, press pause on your device and have a go at that quick quiz. I've just realised there are 11 questions, so there are 11 marks. Some of the questions have 2 parts to them and they'll be half marks each. Have a go and good luck. Okay, let's see what we can remember from last week. Who is the name of the character writing the formal journal? Well, the character is called Zoticus de Lesseps. Give yourself half a mark if you just got his first name. What year is the journal written? It was written in 1863. Who's the narrator? The person writing the journal, assistant to. Well, they're assistant to Professor Aronnax. Who was the salty fisherman harpooner the narrator was introduced to? Well, that was Ned Land, who, if we remember rightly, just grunted when Zoticus was introduced to him. The Queen Hortense is a paddle steamer, and it travelled between Marseille and Cadiz. Give yourself half a mark for each of those. I don't mind if you haven't quite spelt Marseille correctly. If you knew that it was Marseille, give yourself the half mark there. Flora and fauna. Flora is the plants and fauna are the animals. On the way to the destination, strange contraption like a submarine emerges. Well, that is the Nautilus. And we know from the start or the subtitle from Oceanology, we've got the true account of the voyage of the Nautilus. And this is the formal journal of it. The captain of the Nautilus is Captain Nemo. And they were butted aggressively by sea creatures that were sperm whales. And Professor Aronnax thought it was to protect their young. Okay, record your answers, see how you've got on. So we'll now move on to the first objective, text talk. I can think of questions and recognise vocabulary from a formal journal. We're now going on to the next 2 pages from Oceanology. And I'll just zoom in so you can just have a closer look of those 2 pages, and you can see them here. Now, as I did last week, I have taken a photo of the page and then saved it onto the assignments tab of the Microsoft Teams site. And that then gives you a chance, if you want to look at and read yourself, you can do that because you can zoom in and it's a lot clearer than it is on here. So to start with, I've typed up the formal journal and I'm going to read through, ask some questions, and then we're going to focus on the vocabulary that we might see within the text. Let's make a start. We're now up to the 30th of April. 30th of April off Cape Town. We rounded the southern tip of Africa, travelling in shallow water only 160 feet, 50 metres below the surface. The Nautilus carried us through beautiful forests of leafy fronds, dozens of feet tall, which Professor Aronnax explained were called kelp. These kelp forests support a huge diversity of life, providing shelter and food for many small creatures, which in turn attract larger animals. Now, the first thing that I've looked at is the word fronds. Now, usually we would try and work out what this word might mean, and we'll do that with a couple of more examples of vocabulary later on. But today I've just put down the definition, and fronds are the leaf or leaf-like part of a palm, fern, or similar plant. Now, I found this difficult to imagine what it would be like, what the kelp forest might look like. So I put a picture here, but I'm going to talk about a YouTube clip which just gives you an example of what it might be like to swim in between this kelp forest. The link is here, but if you go to Google and you type in kelp forest nature boom time into Google, you'll find that it comes up as the following YouTube clip. Click on the YouTube clip and you'll then have a little bit of teaching about, well, once the adverts have done, skip the adverts, you'll find that you have a clip that's 6 minutes long that gives you a little bit of teaching about the kelp forests, but also a chance to imagine and to see what it would be like to be swimming there. And one other thing that we've got to look at is the map here. I've just taken a little crop picture of the map, and we can see now that they've come all the way down from Cadiz. They've sailed down here in the Nautilus, and they're just going through this part of the ocean at the bottom tip of South Africa. Okay, I'm hoping that you've had a chance to look at that YouTube clip and you have a greater understanding of what a kelp forest might be like. Let's move on now to the next part of the formal journal. Creatures of the past. Among the branches, we glimpsed dozens of huge bones on the seabed, and I asked the professor what kind of beast they could have belonged to. He was unsure, but then Captain Nemo showed some extraordinary sketches of terrifying sea creatures he believed existed many millions of years ago. He had envisaged these creatures based on fossils he had collected in the waters on previous expeditions. He estimated that beasts such as this could have measured 50 feet, 15 meters in length. Ned scoffed at this. "Your stories are as tall as the creatures in them, Captain," he said. However, the professor, an avid follower of the prehistoric discoveries of Owen and Mantell, believed that there may have been some truth to the captain's theory. He was inclined to agree that just as on land, the living creatures living in the oceans are likely to have changed vastly over the millennia. I'd like us now to have a look at two examples of vocabulary. The first one is glimpsed. We glimpsed dozens of huge bones on the seabed. I want you to think now for 10 seconds or so what word class glimpse might be. Just share if you're working with somebody alongside you, or write down on a piece of paper. Press pause. Okay, I'm hoping that you picked out that glimpsed is a verb because it's a state of being or an action, in this case an action. Now we know that it's a verb. We're trying then to think about what type of verb it will be. What if we didn't know the word glimpsed, what action are they doing? Well, I think we could know that because they are in the nautilus, they are looking around, that it is something to do with seeing or looking. Now, it is a very precise word for look, and I want us to look at the definition here that we've got. It's a very brief passing look, sight or view. So it's seeing something really, really quickly. Now on the next part of the slide, I've got some synonyms. Some of them would be synonyms for glimpsed, but there are two that you'd look at and think they're not really suitable for glimpsed. One of them's easy to spot. The other one is a little bit more tricky and it's based on a shade of meaning. Press pause on the video and have a go at writing down the 4 synonyms and the 2 that you think are not synonyms of the word glimpsed. Right, let's have a look. Well, I think the obvious one that we would see here would be devoured. Devoured means to eat. So we know that that isn't a synonym of glimpsed. The trickier one is stared at. And I've picked this one because if we are glimpsing at something, we are seeing it very quickly. Whereas if we're staring, that's going to take a longer period of time. So stared at isn't really a good synonym of glimpsed. It is a good synonym for looked, but glimpsed is a lot more precise. The next word from the text that we're going to explore is envisaged. He had envisaged these creatures based on fossils. Now the word class again is a verb because it's a state of being or an action, in this case a state of being. I want you just to pause on the video and think, what could envisaged be? What synonym could we replace envisaged with? Okay, the definition for envisaged is if you envisage something, you imagine that it's true, real, or likely to happen. So I've created some synonyms for envisaged. But again, one of these isn't a synonym for this word. Just pause on the video and have a look. Which of these are synonyms for envisaged, which isn't? Okay, the synonym that isn't part of envisage is stumble. If you're stumbling, you're going to fall over, so it doesn't match at all in any way or form the word envisaged. What that's really good, though, is imagined or contemplate. He had imagined these creatures based on fossils. We had contemplated, which is to think deeply, that these creatures were based on fossils. Right, let's move on to the next part of the text. So we move on to the next paragraph. An excursion. That afternoon, the captain took us on our first excursion in the Nautosphere. As we drifted along, the sound suddenly rippled, and a huge stingray reared up in front of us. "Where did that come from?" exclaimed Ned. The searchlights illuminated many curious creatures, from the gully sharks and Cape fur seals to rockhopper penguins. On returning from our expedition in the Nautosphere, the professor gave me this booklet about the masters of camouflage that blend in their environment, just like the stingray we had seen. You can see here that in the book we have a booklet that's about 3 or 4 pages in depth, and it has lots of different creatures and information about them. Again, this is an example of an information text telling us about these different creatures. Now, my task to finish today's reading activity and text talk is, if you were Zoticus, what questions would you like to ask Captain Nemo and Professor Aronnax? I'd like you to press pause on your videos, please, and I'd like you to ask those 5 questions. If you can, try to think of higher order questions and a range of different types. Okay, press pause and have a go. Finally, I almost forgot that in the last part of the formal journal that Zoticus writes for today's page, we have a little bit of information. He also showed us this leaflet about the value of seaweed. Indeed, we were often served this strange delicacy in a variety of tasty forms. And that makes sense because people did used to eat seaweed quite a lot. And I do know sometimes people still do have different types of seaweed as a dish that they might eat. A fossilized ammonite from Nemo's collection. He told us that these creatures once filled the prehistoric seas. Okay, let's move on to the main objective for today's lesson. Recapping on the difference between a phrase and a clause, and then recognizing a subordinate clause in a piece of writing. At the end of last week, we were comparing two pieces of writing, one by Zoticus and one by a fella called Paul. And we worked out that Zoticus's piece of writing created a formal tone. And one of the ways that he does that is to use something called subordinating clauses or subordinate clauses. And in this paragraph, there are a number of subordinate clauses. If I highlight some that are here, you can see that once we were ready is an example of the subordinate clause. And we can put that or highlight that just to show it as being a subordinate clause just here. We've also got one here. As the water crept up to our necks is another example of a subordinate clause. And one final one is, but we convinced him that if he refused to join us is another example. Now, subordinate clauses are great. They help to extend our sentences. They help to make our writing flow between sentences, so they help with cohesion of sentences. And today we're going to be looking at recognizing them, and then tomorrow having a go at writing some subordinate clauses ourselves. Before we start though on recognizing subordinate clauses, we need to recap on phrases and clauses. First question, can you remember what a clause is? Press pause on your video and for 10 seconds just write it down on a piece of paper. Okay, a clause is a group of words containing a verb. Here are examples. Can you find the verb? Remember, a verb is an action or a state of being. Press pause on the video and then see if you can identify the verbs in these clauses here. Okay, from the first one, the verb is met. There's the action there. We met two more members of the expedition team. When we introduced ourselves, the verb is introduced. As we sailed, the verb is sailed, the action is sailed towards Cadiz. The ocean is a truly wonderful place. I've just realised that I've missed out the word a in here. Now, the verb here is a bit more tricky. It's is, and it's a hidden verb, and it's a state of being. So just remember that is and was are verbs. Now, finally, countless thousands of species inhabit the ocean. That's the verb there. Now, all of these are clauses because they are a group of words with a verb. Right, let's continue. Here we have got some groups of words. They're either clauses or phrases. I want you to read each in turn. And which two of these are not clauses? Press pause on your video, have a look and see if you can identify the phrases and the clauses. Okay, I hope you've had a chance to do that. The first one here is a clause because we've got the verb appeared. The second one, the murky grey water of the ocean, that's simply a phrase. And if you think back to when we did The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, we can say that's an example of an expanded noun phrase with pre-modification and a bit of post-modification of the noun here. So it's an expanded noun phrase, no verb. As the captain guided us around the vessel. Well, that's a clause because guided is the verb. A small, strange-looking fish with a sharp fin. Again, that's a phrase because there's no verb within it. And it's a great expanded noun phrase. A small, strange-looking fish is the pre-modification. These are the adjectives describing the fish. And then we've got post-modification telling us about a sharp fin here using the word with. It's a great example of an expanded noun phrase, but it's not a clause. So this submarine was to be our expedition vessel. Now, this is a tricky one because the hidden verb is was. It's in here. So it is a clause and it's got that state of being was, the verb to be. Okay, let's move on. So we've just looked at the second objective here. I can recap on the difference between a phrase and a clause. I'll just remind you again, a clause is a group of words with a verb. A phrase is a group of words without a verb. Now today we want to find the difference between a subordinate clause and a main clause. It's quite simple really. A simple sentence is a main clause. A main clause makes sense on its own. So a main clause makes sense on its own. It's a group of words that contains a verb. So let's have a look at a couple of examples. The Nautilus shook. That makes sense on its own. We could have that as a sentence. And if I pick up the highlighter, we can see that the verb here is shook. Water trickled across the deck of the boat. Again, it makes sense on its own. And the verb is trickled. Hundreds of tiny turtles scampered down the beach into the safety of the water. Again, it's a longer sentence than the previous two, but it's got a verb and it makes sense on its own. So all of these are main clauses and they're all simple sentences as well. The subordinate clause, however, has a subordinating conjunction and it doesn't make sense on its own. So it's a group of words that have a subordinating conjunction, a verb, and they don't make sense without being added to another part of a sentence. Now, in order to do that, or before we do that, we've got some examples here. As we entered the cave. This is an example of a subordinating clause because we've got subordinating conjunction as, we have the verb entered, and it doesn't make sense on its own. It doesn't finish. We want to have something extra to that clause for it to make sense. The next one, although the waves were huge. We have the subordinating conjunction here, although the verb, slightly more difficult to spot, were, and again, it doesn't make sense on its own. And finally, we have this one here, while Professor Aronnax examined the microscopic creatures. We have the subordinating conjunction while, we have the verb examined, but again, the clause doesn't make sense on its own. Now, if we know that a subordinating clause has a subordinating conjunction, we need to know the subordinating conjunctions. So below on this slide, I've got a way that we use to remember the subordinating conjunctions. Now, year sixes, you might have heard of this before when we studied it last year. But year fives, I would imagine this will be new to you. I'm just going to zoom in to make it a little bit easier to see, and then we can go on to what's called a white bus. Now, a white bus is a way of remembering some of the subordinating conjunctions. These aren't all the subordinating conjunctions there are, but these are the main ones that we're likely to use in our writing. So if you look at a white bus, we've got A, although, as, after. WH together, when, whenever, whereas, while. I, if. T, though. E, even if, even though. B, before, because. U, until, unless. And S, since. Now this one here, once. It's a really important one. We use it quite a lot, particularly in our writing in year 6, but it doesn't come as part of the white bus. So I've just popped it on the end here alongside the S. What I would like you to do now is to write these down on a piece of paper. I've also put them as a Word document that you can print out because these are going to be important over the course of the next 2 weeks. You should just spend 5 minutes writing these out on a piece of paper and then keep that piece of paper for the next 2 or 3 weeks. Press pause and have a go. Hopefully you've had a chance now to copy down those subordinating conjunctions, and trying to remember a white bus will help you to remember most of them. So let's just recap. A subordinate clause has a subordinating conjunction and doesn't make sense on its own. So let's try and have a go at identifying some here. Once we finished our dinner, well, this is a subordinate clause, because it's got a subordinating conjunction in once, the verb is finished, and it doesn't make sense on its own. I've written that below it. This is a subordinate clause because it starts with once, a subordinating conjunction, and doesn't make sense on its own. The verb is finished. What about this one here? Just press pause on your device and just have a go. Can you identify, is this a main clause or a subordinate clause? Okay, this is a main clause because it makes sense on its own. The Nautilus dived into the depths of the ocean. It's a group of words with a verb, and the verb is dived. I've written that below it. This is a main clause because it makes sense on its own. The verb is dived. I'm just going to correct myself here because I've noticed that I haven't put a capital letter at the start of my sentence. So I'm just going to correct myself and put that in as a capital there. Okay, we're going to move on to today's task. And for today's task, what I'd like you to do is to identify the clauses that are here. You'll see that I've done a couple to start with. So you've got a list of 10 clauses. I would like you to write out these clauses and then underneath write down whether they are the main clause or subordinate clause and why, because either it makes sense on its own or it doesn't, and then to write down the verb. I've also saved this as a Word document on Teams, so you can do this on Teams. But even if you are doing it on Teams, I'd still like you to write out the sentence explaining why it is a subordinate or a main clause and identifying the verb as well. I've done two here as an example, so you can see how you might want to write these out. Okay, last thing for today is in looking at the Eagle Owl's work from last week, many of us have done a really good job of completing the task. I do feel though that some of us, because we're at home, maybe aren't challenging ourselves as we would do in class. We might not be doing the presentation quite as well, or we're not completing as much of the task as we might if we were in school. So can you just think about what would be expected if we were in a lesson at school and try and complete the equivalent amount? I would expect most of the Eagle Owls to do every one of these. A few of you, I would be happy with 4 or 5 of them. If you think that you want to have an extra challenge, you might start thinking about creating your own main clauses and subordinate clauses using the white bus subordinating conjunctions to help you. Okay, I'm going to finish now. I hope you have a good day, and I look forward to seeing the Eagle Owl's work coming back to me, and I'm sure the other teachers will look forward to seeing your work too. Have a good day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye for now.